We want to look now at something new under the sun. That is the burgeoning civil rights movement that occurred along with the post-war prosperity after World War II. There had been attempts to gain civil rights by African Americans to become first-class citizens ever since the end of the American Civil War. But it's only with the movement after the Second World War that we see any dramatic success. And we want to look at three areas of the civil rights movement, of that extremely big and complex civil rights, African American civil rights movement. And these three areas are education, public accommodations, and voting rights. Now, remember, and then we'll finish up by looking at the post-1965 developments in civil rights and African-American self-identification. But we want to remember that the civil rights movement is part of the big complex picture that historians study in toto. That is, well, let me back up and say this. Historians study change over time, but we also study that change within context, and we study what remains the same. That is continuity. And the civil rights movement is a case study in how historians operate. And the way that I present this to you in a series of 4, I hope, medium-length lectures should cover much of that. At least that's going to be my approach to this. So we want to look at the African-American civil rights movement in education, public accommodations, and voting rights. And this particular lecture is about education. African Americans, at least in their public rhetoric, believed that, or said they believed that education was the key to becoming first-class citizens and creating a good life for themselves and their community. Prior to World War II, integration was not the leading edge of securing the rights that the Constitution and particularly the 14th Amendment held out to all American citizens. This is a complex problem, and it's not easily answered in just a moment or two, but suffice it to say that integration of the races was one of those things that African Americans as a community came to somewhat gradually. But after World War II, the leading edge of the rights movements became integration and recognition of rights. Why was integration supposedly necessary? Because separate was never equal. In 1896, the Supreme Court decision of Plessy versus Ferguson had enshrined the legal doctrine of separate but equal. And it became blindingly obvious almost immediately that separate was separate, but equal wasn't going to happen. So it took another 50 some odd years to overcome that long-standing notion that separate and equal were the right thing, not just in the white community, but in the black community as well, because demanding integration was difficult on both communities. This is not to say, and do not get me wrong, that integration should not have occurred. I'm saying that whenever there's a big change, there are things that win and things that you leave behind. The hardest hit group in all of this was the black middle class, because when integration occurred, black businesses, black professionals, doctors, dentists, teachers in particular, lost out. Now, was it right? Would it have been right to have stayed unintegrated? Absolutely not. Integration was the only way to create any kind of equality. And after World War II, so many African Americans saw this same thing, that they moved in the direction of integration in the face of tremendous resistance by whites South and North. So we see the first movements toward desegregation, at least, if not full integration of the races, the two big races as identified in the United States, Caucasians and African Americans, blacks and whites. With Jackie Robinson's entering of Major League Baseball in 1947, he had played in the Negro Leagues and in Major League Baseball's minor leagues between 1945 and 1947, and then in 47, the Brooklyn Dodgers brought him into the majors. This broke the color barrier, quote unquote, created a storm of protest, but also a storm of relief among many people who saw Jackie Robinson as a harbinger of things to come. Robinson did an extraordinary job of maintaining his cool during some extremely trying times. We see in 1947 also that the Congress on Racial Equality, which had been created in 1942, was going to test the Supreme Court decision Morgan v. Virginia of 1946 by creating a bus ride called the Journey of Reconciliation. This was a bus ride to test desegregation as ordered in interstate transportation by the Supreme Court. So 8 black and 8 white men rode together. They purchased their tickets, rode together on buses through Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky. This is a harbinger of the 1961 Freedom Rides. So what happened to these guys in 1947? They were sentenced, 2 of each of the race. That is, four people total were arrested in North Carolina as at the end of this, arrested in North Carolina and sentenced to 30 days or 90 days in jail for breaking state laws on integration of bus facilities. So this test went kind of nowhere, and it left CORE hanging. CORE wanted to continue with these journeys of reconciliation and would do so later. Truman desegregated the military with Executive Order 9981 on July 26, 1948, which was the result of a report produced for him by the Advisory Commission on Civil Rights in 1947 called, quote, "to secure these rights," unquote. The military really did not want to be desegregated, but it did what the commander-in-chief asked of it and did desegregate. Now, you know, on the ground, that may have taken a lot of different forms, but it was a step toward the desegregation, racial desegregation of American society. And finally, we see an uptick in the National Association for the Advancement of Colored Peoples, NAACP's legal assault on segregation in education. And it is these legal assaults on segregation in education that provides education as the first victory in post-World War II civil rights movement actions. In 1950, in the case of Sweet v. Painter, a Texas university had to provide accommodations for a black graduate student in its law school The same with McLaurin v. Oklahoma Regents, that graduate students had to be accommodated if they had been legal residents of a state. The state couldn't simply say, we provide these accommodations for everybody but you, even though you've been paying your taxes. They had to be accommodated. Now Sweet was accommodated by being boxed up, literally, four walls around his seat in the lecture hall at the University of Texas Law School. So, you know, it was desegregation, but not by much. And this was kind of a harbinger of how the established white community would react when the major case in education desegregation came forward. And that was Brown versus Board of Education, a case decided in May of 1954 from 5 cases that originated in 1950 that the Supreme Court bundled together and decided as a unit and called it by the first case alphabetically in the list, which was Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. Now, the difference in Brown and its associated cases were that they attacked public school segregation in public schools, K through 12, not graduate school, not college, like McLaurin and Sweet, but K through 12 education, and that's where most people live. The Supreme Court heard the case basically in 1952, and then again in 54, and they decided, led by the new Chief Justice Earl Warren, to overturn Plessy versus Ferguson of 1896 and to declare that legal doctrine, separate but equal, to be dysfunctional and illegal. So Brown v. Board overthrew Plessy. I'm sorry, I've got my pages out of order here. Anyway, Chief Justice Earl Warren wrote the opinion on Brown v. Board, which overturned Plessy, and it was argued by Thurgood Marshall of the NAACP, who would go on to become the first Black Supreme Court justice appointed by Lyndon Johnson, serving from 1967 till 1991. Now, Brown was not a single decision. In fact, there were 2 decisions on Brown, and the second decision came in May of 1955. The question before the court at that time was, when do we need to get rid of separate but equal? And the Supreme Court backed away from a timetable, saying only you had to implement with quote unquote all deliberate speed. Now, of course, that's so vague as to be up in the air. And it took many states until the 1970s and many other court cases to finally desegregate. This was a long, slow attack on desegregating colleges and eventually public schools. Well, how did the white community respond to this assault on segregation, which was the linchpin of white supremacy, North and South? Well, they responded, they reacted with what is termed massive resistance. Yes, this is a pun on the passive resistance movement that had gained notoriety with Mahatma Gandhi in India, that only 6 years before had overthrown the British Raj in England and guaranteed many white citizens in the United States viewed the civil rights movement as an attempt to overthrow their own Raj, and they viewed Gandhi and his movement in India as part and parcel of a world revolution, and that frightened them. So how do we see massive resistance? Massive resistance began in July of 1954 with the creation of the White Citizens Council, which began in Mississippi. Now you might say, but the Klan predated this. Well, the Klan had been in abeyance, except in a couple places, since the late 1920s, and was really even then only partially motivated by race. And it was a working class movement. It would be reactivated, but primarily after 1960. And it was part of massive resistance, but it was so violent that it was kind of beyond the pale of massive resistance into specialized resistance to desegregation and racial integration. So we have to look at how the general, and by that we mean emerging middle class of the white community responded. And it responded in the South by, first of all, creating the White Citizens Council in Mississippi. By 1956, because of events between 54 and 56, Alabama outlawed the NAACP. Now, the NAACP continued to operate just under different names, but the NAACP itself was accused by the Attorney General in 1956, John Patterson, who would later run on a segregationist platform and beat George Wallace in 1958 for the governorship of Alabama. But he accused the NAACP of not filing paperwork correctly and used that as a pretext to outlaw the NAACP because the NAACP had been encouraging black families to sue local school districts in order to gain admission to heretofore white-only and hereafter white-only schools. Alabama also amended its constitution to disallow the right to a public education. The Constitution of Alabama did not guarantee a public education, but it implied that there was a right to a public education. And so Alabamians, they amended their Constitution in order to say specifically that the state did not have an obligation to give students an education. This was in order to close the schools if African Americans were successful at integrating them. Now, Georgia in 1956 incorporated the old Confederate battle flag into its state flag in 1956. And I bring that up to say that in the 1990s into the 2000s, there was a great brouhaha in one state after another to keep the Confederate battle flag either as part of state flags or as flying over public property. And there was a lot of confusion about this, many people claiming that it went back to Civil War days. And this is just simply not true. In most cases, state flags, except for Mississippi, that incorporated the Confederate battle flag did so in the 1950s or 1960s. And so this is part of signaling massive resistance. Now, even more frightening than what had occurred elsewhere in 1956, Virginia, as part of a whole body of acts, approved what boiled down to school vouchers, the ability to give public assistance to students who wanted to move out of the public school system into private schools. 3 years later, then Prince Edward County in Virginia, if you look at the bottom of this slide, in an effort to keep blacks out of public schools, simply refused to appropriate any money to public schools, and they gave all of their tax money to the voucher program, which went to all white students, and they simply closed down all of their public schools for the years between 1959 and 1964. That's the ultimate in massive resistance. Now, in 1957, a significant confrontation occurred in Little Rock, Arkansas, when Governor Faubus used the National Guard to stop court-ordered integration of Central High School in Little Rock. Now, Eisenhower sent a message to the National Guard and nationalized them, which meant that Faubus had brought them out, and Ike nationalized them. So at one point, they were preventing 9 black students from entering the school, and the next moment they were escorting those 9 black students into school. So Faubus simply closed the public schools in Little Rock from 1957 to 1959. And I believe he lost his gubernatorial race in 59 and reopened the high school in 58, and they reopened the high schools in 59. This business, this closing of public schools, and particularly the Virginia voucher program, led to the beginning of the modern private school movement. Not because education was bad in the public schools, but these were segregation academies, and they existed through the 1970s, and they exist today. Well, what about massive resistance in the second wave? We see the revival of the Ku Klux Klan as a violent, militia-type organization, dead set, sometimes quite literally, on stopping integration by violence. We see an uptick in assassinations, an uptick in murder, an uptick in bombings, all of which point back to the third Ku Klux Klan, which ultimately came under the influence of Alabamian Robert Shelton. At least he became the national face. He was a steel worker, and though there was no nationwide Klan operated out of a single headquarters, there were a bunch of like-minded Klaverns who worked together, shared ideology, and followed the lead of Robert Shelton, a steel worker from Tuscaloosa, Alabama, who was extremely active in opposing integration and desegregation. And I guess the apogee of the massive resistance movement was Governor George Wallace, who became a national figure of white supremacy, though in the 1980s he repented his segregationist stand and was elected governor in 1982 of Alabama yet again, with this time with the massive outpouring of support from African Americans in Alabama. But in 1963, when he took the oath of office, he gave his inaugural address that included the phrase segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever, written by Klansman Asa Carter, who went on to change his name to Forrest Carter, and who wrote the best-selling quote-unquote autobiographical novel, which it was a novel, but it was not autobiographical, The Education of Little Tree. In 1963, Wallace raised the Confederate battle flag over the state capitol. This was in May of '63, just months after he was inaugurated, by being the racial hardliner to protest a visit by Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General and brother of the President, to Alabama to head off one campaign promise that Wallace had made, which he carried out on June 11, 1963, which was his infamous stand in the schoolhouse door. This was a choreographed and planned out symbolic resistance to federal authority by the state in the name of white supremacy, in which Wallace, you see him, the suited individual to the left, literally standing in the supposed door of the schoolhouse at the University of Alabama, opposing the requirement that the University of Alabama admit 2 African-American students. Now, the university had registered and enrolled those students in Birmingham about 3 hours before this photograph was made. Those students came onto the campus at Tuscaloosa, about 50 miles west of Birmingham, and never went to this door, which was just a doorway picked for the lighting. It's at Foster Auditorium. And this was set up. A state trooper who looked like Wallace went from place to place on campus to find where the best photographic opportunity was. And Foster Auditorium at 10 o'clock in the morning was where this occurred. The students, Vivian Malone and I'm sorry, James Cook, were admitted in Birmingham. They were driven to their dormitories, and they were welcomed with open arms, quite frankly, by students who had been prepped for behaving well. Wallace did not want any kind of violence, though his rhetoric was, as his son has said recently, high octane, and it did tend to unleash the violence that was inherent in this situation. It was very tense away from the picture that you see here. The bald-headed fella is Nick Kessenbaum, and the guy with his back to us is the somewhat mysterious John Doerr, who was a major player in all desegregation issues for the Department of Justice, but who I believe he's still alive unless he's died just recently. And he is always in the background, making sure all of this stuff occurs like it's supposed to. Wallace refused to allow the students through this door, though they were nowhere near the place. Katzenbaum finally got authorization to federalize the National Guard, who, just outside of this picture, the general of the National Guard, Adjutant General, asked Wallace to move on federal authority. He did so, and this was over with. A campaign promise carried out. Well, with that, we see that from before Brown, through massive resistance, the civil rights movement did move inexorably with federal promotion toward the desegregation and ultimate integration of graduate schools, colleges, and K through 12. But it took a long, long time. Alabama schools, for example, were not desegregated until 1970, when the state could hold out no longer against federal court orders. And with that, I thank you, as always, for your attention.